Hello everybody, this is the last part 5 of a series of 5 talks for students of Gävle University in Sweden. We've been using criminological ideas to think about social work, looking at how criminology and social work overlap. I've been broadly chronological. I've started with earlier criminological theories and ideas, and now we've been talking about policy in the UK, in the US in the late 20th century. And I want to continue where we left the topic in our last presentation. You'll see a familiar face here, a portrait of Michel Foucault. Of course, I started off my first presentation reading from his book. We'll be returning to his ideas shortly. A good recap of where we left the topic in our last presentation. I left us in the 1990s, thinking about Britain, thinking about America. The UK and the US is seeing a new punitiveness in law and order policy. In other words, we're being more punishing in our criminal policy. We talked about ASBOs. The UK and the US have seen rising prison populations, politicians being tough on crime, lots of macho words there, and the intellectual background behind this, although it's not very intellectual, is what we call right realism. Right realists are pragmatic, they're into zero tolerance approaches, no broken windows, and so on. So that was the background. The pendulum very much swinging to the political right here. Let's continue this discussion. So I left us in the late 20th century, and let's look at some of the technological possibilities that have come up in the last few decades. A key theme in the UK and the US has been the idea of target hardening. In recent years, UK and US politicians have tried to reduce crime by making victims less vulnerable. Neighborhood watch schemes, for example, and also surveillance technology. These video cameras, these closed circuit television cameras that you'll find hanging in front of buildings on street corners. Used to protect property, used to protect citizens, so that if crimes are committed, this will be recorded and the perpetrator can easily be caught. Yeah, ask yourself, what do you think about this target hardening? What is this saying about how we see crime in society? Rather than focusing on the individuals who are committing crimes, we're simply zooming in on the potential victims and making it less likely that they become victims. How do you find that? This topic brings us to this whole question of surveillance, monitoring, observing. Quite fascinatingly, Britain is reported to have the most CCTVs per head of population. We've got 1 camera per 11 people. Isn't that interesting? CCTV in Germany, in contrast, is highly unpopular. Germans hate the thought of these video cameras on every street corner. Spooks them out completely. So it's quite fascinating how Britons are quite keen to have as many CCTVs as possible, and Germans are very much against it. You can ask yourself why. There is an explanation. Scratch your heads. Think about Germany's history in the 20th century. And again, another question, what do you think of this UK solution? More surveillance, more observation as a way of preventing crime in society. Other technological possibilities of the last decade, electronic tagging. Electronic tagging has been piloted as an alternative to some custody sentences. So instead of sticking your offender in jail, you can keep them in the community, but they have to wear a tag, an electronic tag on their ankle. What do you think about that concept? Obviously, there's some interesting possibilities here, in particular, thinking about certain types of offender where you might want to restrict where they are hanging about. So if you want to keep people away from certain places, this is obviously an attractive possibility. But there's lots of ethical questions around this technology. Speaking about these new technologies of control takes us back to Michel Foucault's ideas. So we started off thinking about discipline and punishment. I was reading to you from that book. I told you the way in which the first chapter starts. I read out the story of this torture of a criminal who had tried to kill a king, the torture and the execution. We had the contrast then with this regimented prison life less than 100 years later. So Foucault was observing a shift in how we as a society reacted to crime. In the 1700s with torture and with execution, in the 1800s with a thoroughly planned prison day, a day of work, a day of schooling, a day of religious instruction. So we'd moved on somehow as a society, we'd left torture behind and we'd replaced it with incarceration, sticking someone in prison. Now, we may be shocked to hear of our country's reliance on torture as punishment. The book has its strength in those opening pages because the reader is shocked by the horror story of this description of torture. We may see the 19th century prison as being much more civilized, if you like. Is society becoming more civilized, more humane? Foucault is much more ambivalent here. He sees it quite differently. In modern discipline systems, the behavior of the offender is subject to total surveillance, total control. This is about surveillance, this is about control. And this shift reflects a general interest in controlling large populations. Now, it actually goes back to the beginnings of the modern period, way back, let's say, in the 17th century. But particularly by 19th century Europe, this was very, very clear. We had a great number of institutions. You know, we had our schools, our hospitals, we had our factories and prisons. You know, we add to this our workhouses, a whole number of institutions where we controlled our populations, we controlled their bodies. So Foucault talks about disciplinary power. According to Foucault, a quote here, discipline is how to keep someone under surveillance, how to control his behavior, his aptitudes, how to improve his performance, multiply his capacities, how to put him where he is the most useful. The 1800s shift in punishment, it reflects a move away from these ritualized responses to crimes against people, torturing a few individuals to symbolize a societal response to their crime. We're leaving that world behind, and instead we've got a new punishment designed to examine, to correct, to improve, to supervise, to cure. And this has to be total and methodical. Remember the detail of those prison regulation articles, you know, Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. Drum rolls every 5 minutes to regiment the prisoners' lives. This image you're seeing here, or this set of two images, I've taken them from Wikipedia, but one of them you can find in Foucault's book. So I've opened Discipline and Punish here, and you'll see this is one of the two plates. The other plate portrays a prisoner kneeling in front of his prison door. And the prison which this prisoner is within is actually the prison that you're seeing photographed there on the right. The prison has the most unusual architecture imaginable. This is a concept for prison architecture by a British philosopher, Jeremy Bentham. It dates back to 1790. Bentham called it the Panopticon. And this is something that Foucault is very excited about. He discusses it and he reproduces these images in his book. It's quite hard to interpret what you're seeing here, but basically this prison is completely round. It's a completely circular prison. The cells are on this circular prison wall. And as you can see in this photo, we're looking at something like 100 cells just in our viewpoint. The whole prison may have something like 500. Quite plausibly. And the cells are around the walls, and each one of them has this open gate. So the person in the pillar which you're seeing in the middle, the inspection pillar, the person in there can in principle look into each one of these 500 cells as he or she wishes. Careful blinds inserted in front of the prison warden means that the prisoners, the inmates, they cannot see the warden, but the warden can see them. So effectively, they're under total observation. The inmate in that prison is therefore forced to behave as if they are being constantly observed. Rather than being controlled, they're effectively forced to control themselves. So an utterly fascinating and utterly frightening concept. Foucault, speaking about this, he's fascinated by the technology of the Panopticon, the discipline mechanism, he writes, a functional mechanism that must improve the exercise of power by making it lighter, more rapid, more effective, a design of subtle coercion for society to come. Subtle coercion. Coercion is like force. This is a gentle force, if you like, a gentle force of a society to come. And again, writing in the 1970s, for me, it's fascinating. I'm asking myself, is this society, is this disciplinary society that Foucault foresaw, has it really arrived, certainly in the Anglo-Saxon countries, in the last few decades? For Foucault, the historical transformation to this Benthamesque ease of surveillance and control, it involves the gradual extension of the mechanisms of discipline. They're spread throughout the whole social body, the formation of the disciplinary society. Lots of stuff to think about here. Panopticonic social work, I'm not sure that's a word. It sounds quite frightening, doesn't it? If this focus on control and discipline is here to stay, speaking from a British perspective, and I'm sure my US friends will say the same thing, from our Anglo-Saxon perspective, it looks like it might be. If this focus on control and discipline is here to stay, and the technologies of control continue this rapid development, what are the consequences for social work in the future? Think about that, with the technological possibilities and how it may, in the future, shape our profession. So I'm guessing I'm ending on a kind of cautionary note. Where are we going? It's not clear, but some of the possible routes are, for social workers, really quite frightening. I hope you've enjoyed these talks. Once again, there's a whole bunch of interesting reading out there. And of course, there's even some video material if you want to investigate Foucault's ideas. There's some great stuff online. I've really enjoyed giving you these video presentations. I hope you've enjoyed it too. Looking forward to meeting you guys very, very shortly. Thank you. Goodbye.